This is Covering the Spread. Here are your hosts, Jim Saunders and Dr. Ed Feng.
What is going on, everybody? Welcome on into Covering the Spread. That's right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network and numberfire.com as we are getting you set for College Football Championship Week with Dr. Bob Stoll, or with Bob Stoll, who'll be swinging by of Dr. Bob Sports, breaking down Championship Week for college football and where he sees value on the board this week. My name is Jim Saunders. I am a senior writer and analyst for numberfire.com, joined here as always by Ed Feng. You can find his work over at the Power Rank. You can find Ed on Twitter at the Power Rank as well. Ed, hopefully your Thanksgiving went well. How you doing today?
I'm doing great. Yeah, had a great, relaxing Thanksgiving. Got to watch more football than usual, so that was a big plus, except for maybe the Michigan game. Yeah, hope you had a good Thanksgiving too.
At least the Michigan game was exciting. I know as like someone who lives in Ann Arbor, the excitement factor goes down, but like there were points. That's fun,
yeah.
Right?
Yeah, there were definitely points.
Yeah. I had to pay attention to a college football game again, which is disappointing because Northwestern actually played well, and it didn't happen until the last game of the year, and their offensive coordinator's still gone, so there were really no downsides. It was a great weekend for me, so I'm very happy as we move into championship week. And I think this is a fun one. I love the Pac-12 game being on Friday night. That's always exciting. And it's just like, I think that the Saturday slate is like my favorite day of the year from a sports perspective. You still like to sit back and like watch a good game after good game. Like, you're not always good, but like, it's fun.
Right. Yeah, I mean, the ACC championship is probably not going to light your world on fire.
I mean, Clemson could do some really fun stuff to try to impress the committee. I don't think they're going to get the one, but like, you know, they don't want to be the 4 at least. So,
well, I mean, it'll be interesting, right? I mean, LSU's a 7-point favorite in that game, so that means they should win, but you know, probably about a 1 in 3 chance they don't. So definitely not certain that they're going to win that game. It'll be really interesting to see if they don't win that game, what the committee does and whether they still get in. I think most people think they do because they've just have such the track record this year, similar with Ohio State. But it'd be interesting to see those teams sweat a little bit, losing on a late field goal in either one of those games.
Well, I talked about Oklahoma.
More likely to happen against LSU than Ohio State.
I talked about Oklahoma's championship futures on this show earlier, so I am really hoping LSU does not lose. That would be terrible. So desperately hoping for an LSU win to give Oklahoma still a chance to get in. I don't know how they'd be viewed relative to Utah, because Utah's really freaking good, and I think that Utah really would probably deserve to go in. But from a selfish perspective, Ed, I kind of still holding out hope for Oklahoma there.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think Oklahoma is certainly going to be in the conversation. They really haven't, they haven't been lighting the world on fire kind of this last month.
Yeah.
And Utah has, so that certainly doesn't help them. But when, if Georgia loses, Oklahoma and presuming Oklahoma and Utah win, they're going to be in the conversation that night in the playoff, and neither of them have to worry about Alabama anymore.
Right, exactly, which is a big weight off their mind.
Yeah.
We'll talk about that game in a second because I wanted the under in that game. Whoops. We'll talk about that and Covering the Past in just 1 second. But we have to bring in Dr. Bob in just a bit. You can follow Dr. Bob on Twitter at Dr. Bob Sports and his website, drbobsports.com. We'll preview the championship week for college football with Bob Stoll in just 1 second. NFL preview, we Whale Capper tomorrow. That'll go up on Thursday. To get that, make sure you subscribe to Covering the Spread wherever you get your podcasts, whether it be Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, and while you're there, please leave a rating and review as well, because those do help us out a ton. We'll get to Dr. Bob in just 1 second, but first, let's go back to last week, and I have some crow to eat. Let's go through that right now.
Covering the Past.
All right, so last week on the podcast, we had our Thanksgiving preview extravaganza, and yuck, Ed, for me, not for you, on the college football side of things. Let's go. We had the head-to-head first. We had Wisconsin versus Minnesota. You had Wisconsin minus 2.5. I had Minnesota plus 2.5. Rashad Bateman got this long touchdown early. I started feeling good. It was snowing. Didn't think Wisconsin would be able to make a comeback. And then Wisconsin just dusted Minnesota the rest of the way. So you were very right there, and congratulations. It was a solid game for you there.
Yeah, they dusted them in a dusting of snow.
Yes, exactly. And it was fun football to watch, but did not
Yeah.
go well from a betting perspective for me.
Yeah. I mean, it was interesting. Some of the models that I really trust, Bill Connolly's, Massey Peabody, they had Wisconsin. They had Wisconsin. They had Minnesota in that game. So, I think, there was definitely things on opposite sides of that game. I still definitely did like Wisconsin. I think Wisconsin is a very good team. We'll talk about them later in this Big Ten championship game, and the number that is sitting in the markets right now. But yeah, I mean, Wisconsin did what they had to do, and now they're moving on.
Yeah, 16.5-point dogs. We'll bring that up with Bob here in just a bit. But let's talk about the Iron Bowl, because I mentioned I wanted the under on 50 points for Alabama versus Auburn. And the reasoning there was backup quarterback for Alabama, Mac Jones, hadn't played a quality team yet. Bo Nix had been atrocious against good defenses. And Alabama's defense is nowhere near what it used to be. But at least they seemed still good. They were not good. There was obviously some weird turnover funkiness there, some field goal funkiness, but I had the under on a game at 50 points where both teams almost hit the over by themselves, which is suboptimal, Ed.
Yeah, it's suboptimal. No, Jim, after you talked about that, I went and looked at my numbers, and I think with all the data from the season, and obviously that's accounting for Tua, my number had it at 54. You make an adjustment. I think the adjustment should have been 3 or 4 points. And I really did like the logic of what you were saying. I actually thought about betting it.
Yeah.
I didn't.
Good.
Luckily.
See, I feel bad talking about it and getting it wrong. I would feel worse if it inspired you to bet it and I got it wrong.
No, you shouldn't. That's okay. My decision. But what I'm saying is, I thought the process was good. I mean, Auburn is the best defense in the nation. Didn't show it. Mac Jones was pretty good. Yep. And obviously 2 defensive interceptions for touchdowns. Right. One that was not Jones's fault at all. It went off of his receiver into the hands of the defender for a 100-yard touchdown run. I mean, it was a crazy game all around.
And you don't expect that with Alabama's skill position guys. And it did not go my way. So lesson learned there. And we will move on to championship week next with Bob Stoll in just 1 second. But first, if you want to get in on the action, check out the FanDuel Sportsbook and place your first bet today. If you lose, FanDuel will give you a refund up to $500 in site credit. Visit sportsbook.fanduel.com for more details. Terms and conditions apply. Must be 21 plus and physically present in New Jersey, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, or Indiana. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Let's bring on Bob Stoll now. Find his work over at drbobsports.com and find him on Twitter at drbobsports. We're going to preview championship week for college football, get his favorite bets of the week, and get breakdowns on the 4 biggest games on the slate.
Covering the present.
Let's bring Bob Stoll into covering the spread of Dr. Bob Sports. Bob, I appreciate you taking some time here today. I know this is a busy week and a busy time for you. How you doing today?
I'm always tired. I have all 4 sports going at once: football, basketball, college, and pro. I have a 2.5-year-old and a 3-month-year-old and a wife who needs my assistance. So I basically do what I can during the day, and then I stay up all night long and sleep about 2 hours in the middle of the night.
So you got multiple full-time jobs going on at once, basically, between being a dad and all this stuff. And
Ed knows what I'm talking about.
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's a lot to juggle. And I think that makes things more difficult as we get set into college football championship week. But the good thing is that there are fewer games to diagnose, which is certainly helpful. And Bob, I was looking at your website, drbobsports.com, and in your Week 14 college football recap, you mentioned that there wasn't a lot of value in last week's spreads. And I thought that was very interesting because we're late in the year, things like that. Is that something you've noticed this year and previous years for college football, where the spreads become more efficient as the year goes along? And does that influence the way you bet college football, knowing that is coming?
Yeah, well, the spreads do get more efficient. I bet fewer games later in the year than I do. When the math model cranks up in week 5, there are weeks, some years, where I'm betting 15 sides in week 5 or 6, because my math model just shows so much value. Because I think my math model is really good at differentiating between schedule strengths. I think that's what the best part of my model is. And so that really comes into play when teams start playing conference games and those varying schedule strengths come into play. I find a lot of value in those weeks. But later in the year, last week I had 2 bets, and both of them were based on late information on a quarterback playing or not playing. I went against Toledo as soon as I knew, it was the third string quarterback, and he's been terrible all year. And the other one was UAB when Johnston warmed up the whole game, warmed up before the game, was suited up. You didn't know until right before the game that he wasn't going to play, and then obviously, North Texas didn't cover on an interception return TD. But nonetheless, those are the only 2 games I played, and they were late information games, not anything that stood out during the week. It was a really strange week, but generally, to answer your question, yes, late in the year, fewer games. But my math model's tighter as well, so I need a smaller differential between my math and the line to make a play. So, but generally, yeah, it's the lines are definitely tighter later in the year.
Excellent, Bob. Well, I'll be interested to see what your model says about this week's games. Let's start in the Pac-12. We have Utah versus Oregon. Utah is a 6.5-point favorite. Probably would have been quite a bit less 3 or 4 weeks ago, but this is where we're at. The total's at 49.5. We get Utah's defense against Justin Herbert. What do you see in this game?
If you break it down, offense versus offense, defense versus defense, and I break it down, running offense versus running defense, passing offense versus passing defense, etc. Special teams gets mixed in a little bit. This game, I think Utah is a very, very good team, and I do think they're right there with Oklahoma as far as being, worthy of that final spot if Georgia goes down. What we have here is a Utah offense that's underrated, I think. I think Hundley doesn't get the credit he deserves. Everybody talks about Zach Moss, and for good reason. But Utah's running game is actually just barely better than average on a yards per, compensated yards per rushing play metric, whereas Hundley he's averaged 9.9 yards per pass play. He's been one of the most efficient quarterbacks in the nation. They just don't throw it a lot. But when he needs to throw, he can, which makes Utah probably relatively better than their offensive numbers. Because when he has to throw, he can throw more. And when he does, they become even more efficient. But what you have basically is a Utah offense that's about 1.1 yards per play better than average. Oregon's defense rates exactly the same. And then you can let's look at how each team did versus good defenses. And Utah's offense did pretty well against good defensive teams. They didn't play that well against USC, but you remember Zach Moss was out early, and then USC didn't have to worry about the run as much, and that was the one game that Hundley didn't average more than 8 yards per pass, except BYU in the opener and then the USC game were the only 2 games he didn't average at least 8 yards per pass play, which is amazing consistency. But you could maybe chalk that up to Zach Moss being out and USC not having to worry about that as much, which helped the pass defense. But against Cal, they averaged 6.9 yards per play, which is not easy to do against Cal. And they averaged 6.3 yards per play against Washington. So they've proven that they can move the ball against good defenses. And Oregon's defense has been a little bit suspect versus better offensive teams. They gave up 6.9 yards per play to Washington, 7.2 yards per play to Washington State, 7.4 yards per play to Arizona State. The only team they really shut down that was good offensively was USC. So Oregon's defense, while really good overall for the season, tended to struggle relatively against better offensive teams. So I think that matchup edge goes to Utah. If you look at the other side of the ball, when Oregon's got the ball, they're probably overrated offensively. They've only been 0.8 yards per play better than average compensated. That's worse than Utah's offense. And Utah's defense is one of the better units in the country, 1.7 yards per play better than average. And they also go 3 and out a lot. They do not let you, get down the field. They limit the number of plays you have, which makes them even better. So I think Utah has an advantage on both sides of the ball in this game. I ended up having Utah by 8. My math model total was 44.5, but there's going to be wind and rain in Santa Clara, so that drops it a few points. You see the total's already dropped in the market, and I get 41.5 if you count the expected wind and rain. Of course, it's a little early to know exactly how it's going to be, so I'm sort of projecting there. But I lean with Utah and the under in that one.
Interesting. And how much does weather factor into your model? Because it's good to account for weather, but actually factoring in the model is like another step to that. So how much does weather factor into the equation for you when you're betting totals?
It's something I've added more recently. I never really focused on totals a lot at all, and my model was pretty good in totals early in the year. when the weather wasn't a factor. And then later in the year, it didn't work as well. I was like, it doesn't really work as well. And that's probably because of the weather. So I didn't bet totals later in the year. But I started adding weather factors. And you can, in the NFL model I have, not only do I account for the weather in the particular game, but I account for the average scoring conditions faced season to date.
Interesting.
So if you faced a lot of bad conditions and then play in a dome, you're going to get more of an advantage than a team that plays in a dome who's playing in a dome. So as far as scoring goes, or total scoring, I should say. So you can take it to another level, not just adjust for the game based on the wind and precipitation, wind and rain, but you can also adjust for the weather conditions you faced so far this season, which is something I do in the NFL, but not that's a lot of data to keep for college. I sort of just I can eyeball it and say, well, for dome teams, I do make an adjustment, sort of a second adjustment, but it definitely factors in, and I do it on a yards per rushing play and yards per pass play basis. Weather affects passing far more than running, hardly affects running at all. And so if you are an option team in bad weather, that's going to relatively help you. There's a good example when Georgia Southern played Appalachian State on a windy, cold, I don't know if it was a Thursday night or a Friday night game. Georgia Southern runs the option, and Appalachian State, they run a lot, but they also depend on their pass game. And Georgia Southern's run defense is actually a top 15 unit compensated. So I thought, well, Appalachian State's going to have to run more, and they're going to run right into the strength of Georgia Southern's defense, whereas Georgia Southern's not going to be affected by the bad weather because they run the ball 85% of the time anyway. I just thought it was about 4 points worth of matchup value based on the weather. I ended up playing Georgia State in that game. They won the game. Did they win the game straight up or to lose it at the end? I think they won the game straight up. That was Appalachian State's only loss. So weather does play a factor in my model. Answer yes, and a long answer, but yes, it does, and it's more and more recently in the last couple years.
I think that's very interesting with the 49ers playing in the Superdome this weekend in the NFL after a couple of rainy games out east recently, so that could be interesting there for sure. Let's move to the Big 12 now. Baylor against Oklahoma. We've seen some interesting line movement here too. Oklahoma now favored by 8. It was 9 earlier, and the total has risen. It is 64.5 now. It was 62.5 on Monday. And we saw this matchup already. It was between Oklahoma, and they generated this huge comeback, got the win there, 34-31. How do you view the spread in this game? Oklahoma minus 8, given what we saw in that first matchup.
Well, I think people can overreact to one game.
Right.
Baylor was up 28-3, so you say, well, it was a 3-point game, so you could say, well, Baylor really hung tough with Oklahoma, but you can also say Oklahoma outscored Baylor by 28 points in the second half. I mean, there's two ways to look at it. So I sort of just count it as one data point. I don't put extra weight on that one particular matchup. Actually, my line of scrimmage rating, which is a combination of yards per play and play differentials, et cetera, Oklahoma line of scrimmage rating was plus 15 points. So they won by 3, but they outgained them by more than 200 yards and dominated the ball. So Baylor maybe had an early lead, but Oklahoma fumbled the ball 5 times. They were as sloppy as they've been all year. They lost a couple of those fumbles, and they had an interception or 2 as well. So I wouldn't put too much weight into that. I do think the spread. Here's the thing about Oklahoma is their yardage, their points don't match up to the yardage. Their yards per play stuff is so amazing, and the total yards is so incredible. They should be scoring more points than they are. I think a lot of that has to do with a lot of that yards comes on big chunk plays in the pass game, and that doesn't necessarily translate to scoring in the red zone. So I think the red zone efficiency is not equivalent to their overall level of offense. So they tend to score less than their stats would project. So there's 2 ways to look at it. I could say, well, based on the stats, I have Oklahoma by 13. Mm-hmm. Based on the points, I have Oklahoma by 9 on the compensated points model. And sort of in between is where I think this should go, and I get 11.5. Okay. So I do think there's value on Oklahoma here, and the total I get in between where it opened to where it is now, I get 63.5. So I'd probably lean with Oklahoma. I don't think I'm going to play the game, but I'd definitely lean with Oklahoma.
Yeah, Oklahoma's been super interesting just because, Jalen Hurts, it feels like Big 12 defenses have kind of been able to figure out the passing game, and he's been running a lot more. So that's remarkably different from what you saw the first 4 games, where Oklahoma was throwing a lot and getting more of those chunk yards. Any thoughts on that in terms of kind of their play selection and how they've decided to their runs pass splits?
Well, I think it was running quarterbacks, and Hurts is he runs when he needs to run. I mean, he might have a game where he runs 5 times because he doesn't need to if he's playing Kansas or something.
Right.
But running quarterbacks are tricky. You can ask Nick Saban about this. Relatively, running quarterbacks do relatively better against great defenses. Because Alabama had trouble with Manziel and with Cam Newton. You just go down the list, and the Auburn teams, when they had a running quarterback, other than Cam Newton as well, Alabama's always had trouble. New England's had trouble in the NFL against really good running quarterbacks. You just saw that with Lamar Jackson. And I think the reason is you can have a perfect defense called and players playing the scheme perfectly, and a running quarterback can just blow that up and gain 25 yards.
Right.
Whereas a non-running quarterback is going to be shut down on that play because the defense was called correctly and played correctly. So I think relatively running quarterbacks I found do relatively better against better defensive teams. And Baylor is a very good defensive team. In fact, they haven't allowed more than 5.6 yards per play to anybody, including Oklahoma. Now, Oklahoma ran 84 plays to get their 524 yards in that game. That's 5.6 yards per play. So that's really impressive. Baylor's played really well all season against good offensive teams on a yards per play basis. That's the one thing that I find interesting. But I do think if Hurts needs to run more, he will run more. So that gives them an edge, I think, relatively in this game.
Yeah, because
Sounds
when
good.
he has run, he's been crazy efficient too. So that's definitely not a bad thing for Oklahoma if he winds up doing that more often. Let's move to the SEC championship game here. We got Georgia versus LSU. LSU is favored here by 7 points, a total 54.5, and we might be getting a matchup between the best offense in the nation against the nation's best defense. So how do you see this one playing out here, Bob, with Joe Burrow against Georgia's defense?
Well, first of all, Ohio State's easily the best defense in the nation, but Georgia's got a very good defense. Their defense is 1.5 yards per play better than average, and they force a lot of 3-and-outs as well. LSU's offense is 2.5 yards per play better than average. So LSU does have a better offense than Georgia has defense. And here's what LSU's done against other good defenses they faced. They averaged 10.9 yards per play and scored 42 points against Florida. That's amazing. Now, let's maybe throw that out as an outlier. So then they've had Auburn and Alabama. And Auburn is probably the team that is most like Georgia as far as defensive rankings go. Alabama's not quite in that level, but they're still very good. They averaged 6.0 yards per play and only scored 23 points against Auburn. So, I mean, that's sort of a negative for LSU. But they also averaged 7.4 yards per play and scored 46 points against Alabama. So you combine just those two games, even throwing out the Florida outlier, you see how they did against Auburn and Alabama, and they were 3.1 yards per play better than average relative to who they faced, whereas they were 2.6 yards per play better than average overall. So relatively, they did play better versus better defensive teams, while Georgia played about the same versus relatively in a yards per play, compensated yards per play basis when they played good offensive teams. The best offensive teams they faced were Notre Dame, Florida, and Texas A&M, which are good, but no one great. They have not faced a team like this. And in those games, they gave up 17, and 13 points. But I think LSU is so much better than any team that Georgia's faced this year. It'll be interesting, but when the model's all said and done, the model just looking strictly at every game counting the same would favor LSU by only 5.5 points. But if you weight it based on sometimes I do regression analysis based on how each team has done. Maybe I take the yards per play based on the yards based on the level of the defense and find if there's a pattern, a positive or negative slope. Like I said, LSU plays relatively better against better defensive teams. That factors in a little bit. Georgia's offense has not been as good versus better defensive teams. They've been much worse versus better defensive teams than they have early in the year. They put up huge numbers against non-conference opponents. They got into the SEC, and their offense got really stagnant. So relatively, they're not as good versus good defensive teams. Even though LSU isn't great defensively, they are good defensively. So I end up, when you factor that stuff in, I get LSU by 7.2 points and a total of 58.
Interesting. So, Bob, let's go on to the last game. The Big Ten championship game is Wisconsin versus Ohio State. Ohio State's a 16-point favorite with the total at 56. Ohio State has been on a roll, and they continue to be on a roll. Last week, they did, the first half was kind of close in the first time they played Wisconsin, but they did pull away in the second half. What are your numbers seeing this game? I'm particularly interested in this side because 16 seems like a lot of points for against a very good Wisconsin team.
Yeah, in the first game, like you said, it was kind of close early, but Wisconsin couldn't move the ball the whole game. I mean, it was just a matter of time before Ohio State, the offense started to click. They outgained them by 245 yards and 6.2 yards per play to 3.7 overall. They won by 31. The line of scrimmage rating, as I've discussed before, was plus 23 points. So they really dominated that game. I don't think it's going to be quite that way this time. That one was at Ohio State. And that was the only game in which Wisconsin's offense was really shut down by a good defense. In other games against good defensive teams, they played really well relatively against Michigan, Michigan State, Iowa, and last week against Minnesota. The only time they haven't played relatively better than normal against a good defensive team was against Ohio State. It could be an aberration. It could be something about the matchup in that particular matchup. But I tend to think that more data against good defensive teams is more relevant than the one game versus Ohio State's defense. So I think Wisconsin generally plays good against good defenses relatively. Of course, Ohio State plays pretty good against good defenses as well. I mean, against Michigan State, Northwestern, Wisconsin, Penn State, and Michigan, which are the good defenses they faced, they were 2.1 yards per play better than average in those games. Overall, they were 2.0 yards per play better than average. They were a little bit better versus better defensive teams. And Wisconsin's defense was a little bit better versus good offensive teams. That's sort of a wash. Wisconsin's offense a little bit underrated. Like I said, they played really well. Aside from that one game against Ohio State, they played really well against those good defensive teams. But Ohio State, against the good offenses, was relatively better as well. Indiana, Nebraska, Wisconsin, Penn State, and Michigan were the good offensive teams that Ohio State's defense faced. They only gave up 4.2 yards per play in those games, which is just incredible. But when it's all said and done, I think the line is a little bit high. I get Ohio State by 14, and I get a total of only 54 points, even though it's in a dome, which adds scoring. So I think the total's a little bit high. So I think the second game goes under just like the first game did.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the total too, because when the first time these two teams played, it was 51.5. It started there. I like the over, and then I think the market moved to under 50. And this time you see it open at roughly the same value, like 52, and now it's up to 56. So Are we really saying it's almost 10 points because they're playing in a dome this time, or do you have any thoughts on that?
The dome add points, but really the dome only add about 3 points based on my model. Okay. So I think it's a little bit overblown. I'm not exactly sure why. Wisconsin also slows down the game, so Ohio State's not going to have as many possessions as they normally do. I think maybe that's not factored in. It doesn't look extremely high. Like the total's 56.5, and I come up with 54 in a dome. So it's not out of hand, and I'm not going to bet the under. But I do think there's some value. If you're looking at the under, I think there's some value there, and a little bit of value on Wisconsin getting 16, but also not something I'm going to bet. Ohio State is just such a dominant team. If they really want to turn it on, they could be better than they are in general. So.
And the other part, too, you're talking about Wisconsin's pace. Like, they should want to go slow here, too. Like, you should run Jonathan Taylor every play. You should make this thing as slow and as sloppy as humanly possible, because when you're a 16.5-point dog against one of the best teams in the nation, you want to muck things up a bit. So I think that just kind of feeds into that and makes it even more extreme than it already is with their offense.
I think they're going to have to, actually what's interesting is I think Ohio State's the only team in the country that actually allows more yards. Well, maybe there's a few, but they allow more yards per rushing play, 3.8, than they allow yards per pass play, 3.5. So you are better off. I mean, not that Wisconsin, if they know Wisconsin's going to run every time, then Ohio State's going to be able to stop it. But I have Wisconsin averaging 5.1 yards per rushing play and only 4.5 yards per pass play. So they might as well run the ball more. And normally in better weather conditions, this being a dome, you do throw more. But I have in my model, I didn't factor that in. I'm like, why would Wisconsin throw more? Right. So they're probably going to run more, which slows down the pace even more than it already does. So Ohio State's not going to have the number of possessions that they normally do. So I just think there's some value and because of that, you also give Ohio State less chance to increase the margin, which is probably why I've got 2 points of value on the dog and 2 points of value on the under. It's probably tied in the same thing.
Interesting. Yeah, and those definitely are related for sure. Anything else you see on the board you like here for championship week, Bob? We talked about the big 4 games. Anything else stand out to you as of right now?
No, I'm not betting anything this week. I don't have enough value in any game. I mean, I haven't done the full analysis on everything yet, but just I've done it on these games because we were going to talk about them today, and I want to be prepared. But in the other games, I'm glancing at the model. I don't see anything worthwhile. I mean, maybe I'd go against UAB if Johnston doesn't go again, but he's going to play. I don't know. I mean, he suited up and warmed up last week. He actually went in for a play and threw a pass. So I don't know why they were holding him out last week, but I imagine he'll probably play in this game. But then again, if they had lost last week, they wouldn't have been in this game. So that was an important game, and he didn't play. So I think if Johnston doesn't play for UAB, I might look to go against UAB this week. But other than that, I don't really see anything.
All right. That is Bob Stoll. You can find all of his work over at drbobsports.com. Bob, I really do appreciate you swinging by, taking time out of your 2 full-time jobs effectively, and chatting with us for a bit. I appreciate the time, and good luck this weekend. Hopefully we'll talk to you again soon.
All right, guys. Appreciate it. Thanks for having me on.
Covering the future.
All right, one final thank you to Bob Stoll for swinging on by. Again, find all of his work over at drbobsports.com and find him on Twitter at drbobsports. And Ed, I think the interesting discussion there was Wisconsin plus 16.5, because I think that game is fascinating. I have been hesitant to go against Ohio State this entire year, and it sounded like your model likes Wisconsin too. Is it enough for you to bet it, or are you just wary of diving in there?
Yeah, my model says 10.5 points. I mean, I think 16 is such disrespect for what this Wisconsin team has done. Yeah. I think they're an excellent football team. When I look at their top 10 and my adjusted success rate on both sides of the ball, Jack Cohn has been, I mean, obviously Jonathan Taylor is the most important piece on that offense. I think he's the best running back I've seen in college football over the last couple of years. I think he's significantly better than Barkley. And Cohn's been really good. I just think this is a really good team. I thought about talking about that for covering the future. I've thought about betting it. I decided no so far on both of those. Yeah. I guess I'm done for talking about it. But it's interesting, because there's difference between betting and what I want to talk about on the show. Right. Because if I tell you something on the show that I think has value, but then you look like a complete ass the following week, that doesn't feel good for anyone talking about it or listening to it. No. And, I think, another example, Rufus Peabody came on my podcast like early in the year, and he's like, yeah, I'm definitely taking Miami. And this was early in the season when they were hanging some big numbers. They were some big dogs, and like he was talking 21. About that. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And that's just another example of like, I personally would not talk about that game. Right. I would bet it, but I don't want to talk about it on the show. And you can definitely see the character of these games, right? I mean, there's a lot of, for example, like that Michigan State Rutgers game, taking the under, like there's a pretty low probability that you're going to get embarrassed in that game, right? Right. Knowing those teams. You could lose, but you're not going to get embarrassed. You can get embarrassed with Wisconsin plus 16.5. I actually just with what's going on with Ohio State. I get that. There was a game between the Jets and the Giants earlier this year, and I like the Jets a lot because I thought that they were 2.5-point dogs because it was right after that Miami loss, and I was like, I refuse to tie my name to the Jets after this Dolphins game. They're a volatile team. I hate them. I did bet it, but I refuse to tie my name to it. It worked out. But like there are some situations, and now Mitchell Trubisky's back in that zone because I bet the Bears plus 6.5, talked about it here on the show, and Trubisky couldn't score 8 points. So there are just certain situations where it's like, I feel good enough about this to talk about it, or I feel good enough about this to bet it, but they're different things. If I talk about it, I feel good enough to bet. I'm not going to give you a number that I don't feel good enough to bet, but there are numbers I will bet that I do not want to talk about publicly. Right, exactly. And I think actually we should mention like that Alabama-Auburn game that we just talked about. Yeah. That was one I would put a low probability of getting embarrassed in too. So it's not happened. It can happen, even if it doesn't look, We hit that full end of the range of outcomes there. It was great. Exactly. You get stuff in the tail, and And sometimes it happens in the Iron Bowl.
Yep. It is one game, and we are on to Championship Week. And we'll talk more about Championship Week in just 1 second. But first, Ed and I always preach searching for the best value in betting on games. I'm not sure you could have gotten a total of 90 in the Iron Bowl, but hey, whatever. But you can look on OddsFire, and that's the new odds comparison they've developed over at NumberFire.com. OddsFire is the premier odds comparison experience across major bookmakers in the regulated U.S. market. Compare odds, quickly identify the best value, and even examine first-party FanDuel data all in one place. Never settle, always get the best odds. Check out the experience for free now on NumberFire or at oddsfire.com. Gambling problem? Call 1-800-GAMBLER. Let's move now into covering the future. And Ed, you want to talk about Georgia versus LSU in this SEC championship game. What did you see in this one here?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a rough road for Georgia's offense the last couple of weeks. They haven't looked particularly good. But I think you really do need to keep in mind like who they've played. All these teams have top 20 defenses by my adjusted success rate. Texas A&M, Auburn, Missouri, and Florida. So it's a tough road for any team. And I think the one thing that I am very confident about what I do is adjusting for strength of schedule with the algorithms that I use and even some that I've developed myself. So when you look on offense, like Georgia's offense is 10th in my adjusted success rate after adjusting for schedule. And I think I talked about this a couple weeks ago. I forget which game I was talking about. Their offense is probably better. Like it certainly hasn't been explosive, but I think it's a better offense than what has happened on the scoreboard. I think they're going to be competitive with LSU's 7th ranked defense. So, all right, a couple assumptions here. DeAndre Swift is going to play, I presume. I know he got banged up in the last game. Their leading receiver, George Pickens, is out for the first half, but he'll be back for the second. Their third leading receiver, Lawrence Cager, is out for this game. So there are those caveats as well. Other side of the ball, LSU's offense has been a revelation. We've talked about Joe Burrow, the best in the nation at adjusted success rate. Georgia's defense has been good as well. When I look at adjusted success rate, they're the 12th best defense in the nation. They're actually a lot better when you look at yards per play. When you adjust that, they're 4th. And it's interesting to me because this is the second year in a row that they've looked better by yards per play than by success rate. And I'll definitely be watching this game to see whether that's scheme or what they're doing. Are they playing guys back to prevent big plays? Maybe something akin to the air yards that Bob talked about when we had him on to talk NFL. But anyways, my number says the total should be about 60.5. I think there should be a little bit of a downward adjustment just with the injuries and suspensions that Georgia has at receiver. But I do think there's value at over 54.5 in this game.
And I think that one thing that's worth considering here is that LSU is potentially locked into the college football playoff, but you kind of want the style points to lock up that 1 seed. Bud Elliott, he rotates in on the newsletter for Banner Society, and I'm subscribing to that. And there was an email from Bud today talking about how the value of the 1 seed this year is higher because the 3 seed is likely to be so good. You don't want to face the 3 seed. Is essentially the line of thinking there. He went back through the past couple of college football playoffs, looked at the strength of the 3 seed this year, whether it be, likely Clemson, and relative to other years, and how much you want to try to avoid facing basically Clemson in the first round. And I think that adds juice not only to LSU, but also to Ohio State. Like, you want to impress. And that could lead you towards the spread, but I think that the more impactful thing here is the total, because I think that, LSU going to try to run things up a little bit. And it could also just be me being delusional, but I still think that Jake Fromm is a talented quarterback who is held back by his system, and the system cannot hold him back as much if they're in catch-up mode. Like, if they need to make up points, they're going to let Jake Fromm throw it deep. Again, I don't know if this is me being delusional, where I think that everything that Jake Fromm does, like check down king, is a product of the system. But I think he is a talented thrower who can go deep when he needs to. And I think that helps lends itself to the over as well.
Yeah. So I think, I'm definitely looking for LSU maybe to be up 2 touchdowns at halftime. Right. And then things could work out pretty well for going over.
Right. Jake Fromm can be efficient. Like last year, his adjusted yards per attempt was 10.1. Yeah. Like, that's a really good number. And that helps.
And there was a ton of turnover in his receiving core, and we know that receivers like own the air yards or how
Right.
far they go, at least in the NFL. I'm suspecting that the same thing is true in college as well. I wonder how that's playing out,
Yeah.
in addition to what's going on with the play calling.
Exactly. So I think that I would agree with you there. The over is pretty enticing. So I'd want the over in the SEC championship game. I want to talk about a game we did not discuss with Bob, and that's Memphis versus Cincinnati, which is a game we actually just saw last week. And Memphis is a 9.5-point favorite here, and I think the spread between these teams, the split between these two teams, is actually a little bit larger than the spread here implies. Because if you look at Number Fire's rankings, it has Memphis 17th overall in its power rankings, whereas Cincinnati is 33rd. And obviously, Memphis' offense should be able to do work here. Cincinnati's defense is very good, but Memphis has like a top 10 national offense. And I think they should move the ball here. But I think their defense is a little bit underrated too. Memphis is 33rd in defensive SP+, according to Bill Connolly of ESPN. So it's not mind-blowing, but I think it's better than perception when it comes to Memphis, whereas Cincinnati's offense is 70th. So if you look at this matchup that they had last week, and Bob did talk about how you don't want to overvalue one matchup, but I think people could use this matchup to say, hey, why would you want Memphis 9.5 when they just lost by 10 in Memphis last week? They're back in Memphis again, and now they're starting quarterback. They started redshirt freshman Ben Bryant in that game. It sounds like Desmond Ridder should be able to go this time around, which could skew things more toward Cincinnati. But Ridder, I don't know how much of like an addition that really is for Cincinnati. He's played the full year and he's averaged 6.9 adjusted yards per attempt. So I would assume he's a bit less erratic than Bryant, because Bryant had some sacks, had a couple of picks last week. Probably less erratic, which makes it less volatile. But I don't think it's necessarily a lift to this offense. And Memphis' offense was really good in that game. They averaged 6.75 yards per attempt there. Cincinnati was at 5.29. So Ridder would need to lift this offense quite a bit in order to erase the gap between these two. And again, this is a championship game, but it's the AAC, which means that it is actually in Memphis. It is not a neutral site, which is important to keep in mind here. If you look at Number Fire's metrics, they have Memphis as a 12-point favorite for this game, so getting them at 9.5, I think seems fully appropriate. You can get this number at 9 in some places. I believe it was at 10 earlier in the week. So things are shifting towards Cincinnati. I'm assuming that's because Ridder is more likely to play now than he may have been earlier in the week. But at 9.5, I'm still good rolling Memphis. So do some price shopping here. See which lines you can get. If you can get 9, take it. It's at 9.5 at FanDuel Sportsbook right now. That I am actually okay with that number for the AAC Championship. So I've got Memphis minus 9.5. Ed, do your numbers have any lean on this game between Memphis and Cincinnati?
Yeah, I was just looking at it. I mean, my number says 9.5. But when you break that down, when you just look at the database on this year, it would push it up to almost 11. And so obviously it's being pulled down by a little bit of the preseason prior. And
right.
Cincinnati was definitely pretty, highly regarded coming into the season. I agree with you about Desmond Ridder. I don't think he's actually been good either of the 2 years he played. Kind of had some incredible third and long numbers last year that really helped that offense, despite the fact that they didn't look good in adjusted yards per play. Not much has changed. I'm looking at it right now. I mean, they're like 81st in adjusted yards per play this year. And a lot of the numbers agree with you that Memphis is just better on both sides of the ball. We know what they do on offense, but with defense, they're 32nd in my adjusted success rate, which is actually better than either Cincinnati. It's a better rank than Cincinnati's offense or their defense.
Yeah.
So, I think the logic is sound there. I think, the numbers definitely do like Memphis there.
And I wouldn't mind holding off on this one because given that the movement has been towards Cincinnati so far, if you want to hold off, I think that's probably not a terrible idea. But if you can get it at 8.5, I would definitely go then. But I think even at 9.5, I am very okay going Memphis in this game for the AAC Championship game. Should be a fun week of football, Ed. I'm looking forward to seeing how things go down. Should be a delight. Again, like I said, this is one of my favorite weekends of the entire year. Get to sit back. I remember the Dr. Pepper advertising throughout always made me drink Dr. Pepper when I was a kid during the championship week. It was weirdly the most effective advertising. And I had a very acceptable mind to advertising. So, that should be noted. But, I would consume a lot of Dr. Pepper back in the day because of this. So, fun weekend.
Is Larry Culpepper your kind of guy?
No. The marketing has changed significantly since then. I think at this point, the number of ads for Dr. Pepper has just flooded my brain, and I just can't swim out of it anymore. But I just remember fond memories of being in my parents' basement, watching the Big 12 championship with like Darren Sproles or whatever it was back in the day. It was always a good time. So looking forward to this weekend. What do you have coming up over on the Power Rank and on the Football Analytics Show for this week?
Yeah, I mean, definitely sign up for my email newsletter at thepowerrank.com. Usually give a sample of predictions I usually save for paying members of the site. But remember, bowl season's coming up.
Yeah.
And I'll give you a bowl cheat sheet that'll let you easily, if you're in a hurry, fill out your bowl pool with confidence points. So you can do that at thepowerrank.com.
And I have not done too well in those recently, so I'm going to check that out for sure. And I'll go to thepowerrank.com to get that. You can follow Ed on Twitter at thepowerrank. I am at Jim Sannes, JimSannes. You can also follow the FanDuel Podcast Network at FanDuel Podcast on Twitter. Big thank you to Calvin Theobald running the video side of things for today. Thank you, Cal, as always, for keeping us on the air there and chopping up clips for the at FanDuel Twitter account. Thank you to Bob Stoll for joining us for today, breaking down his bets for championship week across college football. Find his work at drbobsports.com. Finally, big thank you to all of you for tuning in for today. Back again tomorrow with Whale Capper to break down Week 14 across the NFL. Subscribe to Covering the Spread to make sure you get that right as it is posted. We'll talk to you again then. This has been Covering the Spread right here on the FanDuel Podcast Network.